Welcome back, Deep Divers. Today, we're going to be looking at police corruption. Specifically, we're going to be diving into the NYPD.
Oh, wow.
Our main source for this one is a guy, Sergeant Steve Lee.
Okay.
And he did this really interesting interview on the Lucky Boys podcast. Now, Lee spent years undercover infiltrating a network of corrupt cops. I mean,
that takes a lot of guts to do something like that. I mean, undercover work is already high stakes, but like infiltrating your own colleagues.
yeah,
That's a whole other level.
it's insane. And to blend in, he had to really walk a tightrope. He had to appear corrupt himself.
Yeah.
Even taking money from these crooked cops, all while, of course, gathering evidence for internal affairs. It's crazy. It's like something out of a movie. He even describes this dark inner circle controlling things, which is a phrase that I think is really interesting. How would you interpret that, expert speaker? What does that actually mean in real-world terms?
Yeah. That's a good question. I think Lee's use of dark inner circle might sound like, a little dramatic, a little sensational.
Right.
But I think what he's talking about is a very real phenomenon.
Okay.
And I don't think he necessarily means like some secret society with, rituals and oaths and all that.
Right.
But rather a network of individuals who are kind of exploiting their power and connections for their own personal gain.
Mm.
So think of it like this. You have a group of officers
Mm-hmm.
who are very much entrenched in this system of like favors and loyalty. So they protect each other. They turn a blind eye to misconduct.
Oh, okay.
And they use their influence to, advance their own interests.
So it's less about a conspiracy
Yeah,
and more about this culture of complicity.
exactly. And Lee breaks down this culture into like these concentric circles.
Okay.
So you have like the outer circle,
Mhm.
the majority of officers who might be aware of some shady dealings, but they aren't actively involved. And then you have the inner circle. These are the ones with, as Lee calls them, hooks.
Hooks.
Hooks, yeah. And these are the officers who have connections to influential figures, maybe in politics,
Okay.
maybe in organized crime, people who can pull strings, grant favors.
So these hooks are like bargaining chips, a way to gain leverage
Yeah,
and kind of exert influence within the system.
precisely. And it could be something as simple as, calling in a favor to fix a parking ticket. Or something far more serious, like influencing promotions.
Oh, wow.
Or making evidence disappear. And then at the very core of this web of corruption, you have the inner core. These are the truly corrupt officers, the kingpins, who wield significant power. And they really call the shots.
And Lee witnessed this firsthand, right? He saw how these power dynamics actually played out in the real world.
Absolutely. He actually gives a chilling example of community leaders who supposedly represent the people, right? But instead, they're using their ties to organized crime to influence promotions within the NYPD.
That's crazy.
It's disturbing. It really highlights how corruption can extend beyond the police force itself.
Yeah.
And it intertwines with these other power structures in society. So it's a disturbing reminder that corruption rarely exists in a vacuum.
It's not just a few bad apples spoiling the bunch.
Right.
It's more like the barrel itself is rotten.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, the system itself becomes conducive to corruption. And what's even more fascinating and unsettling is how individuals get lured into this world. And Lee describes it as this gradual seduction, a process that often starts with seemingly harmless favors.
Okay. This is where I think it starts to get really interesting for me. Because Lynn doesn't just tell us about, what corruption is, but also how this corruption actually happens. He was in the trenches, seeing how, good cops can be pulled into this web.
Right.
He talks about free meals, drinks, maybe a little help with a speeding ticket, things that on the surface seem almost friendly.
Right. It's all about building relationships, fostering a sense of camaraderie and obligation. It's kind of like the classic foot in the door technique. You start with a small request, something that seems insignificant, and then gradually escalate to bigger and bigger asks.
So the line between a harmless favor and a corrupt act kind of gets blurred over time.
Exactly. And by the time an officer realizes how deep they are, they're already entangled. They might be receiving significant financial incentives, or they might be threatened with exposure or retaliation if they try to back out.
Right.
It becomes a trap, a system that's really designed to perpetuate itself.
So it's not always about a conscious choice between right and wrong,
Right.
but more about being drawn into this system that makes it hard to escape.
That's a key insight, and it challenges the simplistic notion that corruption is just about bad apples, right?
Right.
Lee's experience suggests that even well-intentioned individuals can be seduced by this culture of complicity if they're not vigilant.
And there's another layer to this, right? Lee specifically mentions how cultural factors can make officers more vulnerable to these tactics.
Oh, yeah.
He talks about how in Chinese culture, there's this strong emphasis on gift-giving and showing respect for authority.
That's an important point. Cultural norms play a significant role in shaping our understanding of what's acceptable and what's not. In some cultures, offering gifts or favors might be seen as a sign of respect, a way to build relationships.
So what might seem like a bribe in one culture
Yeah,
could be interpreted as a gesture of goodwill in another?
precisely. And that's why understanding cultural nuances is crucial, especially when you're dealing with a diverse police force like the NYPD.
Right.
It's about recognizing that what constitutes corruption can vary depending on the cultural context.
This is already so much to unpack.
Yeah.
And we've only just scratched the surface. Lee's account provides a fascinating and disturbing glimpse into the inner workings of police corruption. And what's even more unsettling is that his story is not unique. These patterns of corruption can be found in many organizations where power is concentrated and accountability is weak.
That's right.
Lee's experience is a cautionary tale, reminding us that corruption can exist in the most unexpected places, even within the institutions we rely on to uphold the law.
And his story underscores the need for vigilance, transparency, and a commitment to ethical leadership at all levels of an organization.
We'll delve deeper into those themes as we continue our deep dive into Lee's experience.
I'm looking forward to it.
So, we were just talking about cultural nuances and how that can influence people's perceptions of corruption. And I keep thinking about Lee's description of these karaoke bars
Yeah.
and how they played into this whole scheme. I mean, for him, those places weren't just like a place to unwind after a shift.
Yeah.
They were like strategic tools
Oh, yeah.
used by the corrupt officers to further their activities.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
How these seemingly innocuous spaces become like hubs for these corrupt relationships to kind of foster.
Right.
I think it's kind of brilliant, but obviously pretty insidious.
Yeah.
So you see karaoke bars, they provide this very relaxed and informal setting where officers can, they can let their guard down, they build camaraderie,
Right.
develop a sense of trust with each other. It's very different from like the rigid hierarchy and scrutiny of the police precinct.
And then Lee talks about how the women working at these bars were so good at making the officers feel special.
Yeah.
It wasn't just serving drinks.
Right.
It was very calculated.
Oh, yeah, it was a role.
Like,
Yeah.
they were playing a role.
Absolutely. And it's a classic manipulation tactic
Right.
by kind of catering to the officers' egos and making them feel valued and appreciated. These women create a sense of obligation for the officers. Like
Yeah.
they need to reciprocate these gestures of kindness.
It's almost like they're being like a psychological trap.
Yeah.
You get drawn in by the flattery and the attention, and next thing you know, you're indebted to these people.
Precisely. And this sense of indebtedness can be exploited to, extract favors, to secure loyalty, and to silence potential whistleblowers. It's a very subtle but very powerful form of control.
It's amazing how these seemingly harmless activities, like, singing karaoke, enjoying a few drinks, can be weaponized to corrupt a system.
I know.
It shows that corruption doesn't always happen in smoke-filled back rooms with, shady deals being struck. It can happen in plain sight, disguised as everyday social interactions.
Exactly. And, what makes it even more concerning is that Lee reveals even his internal affairs handlers.
Right.
The very people tasked with rooting out corruption were tempted by the perks that were being offered at these karaoke bars.
Wait a minute.
Yeah,
Even the watchdogs themselves?
Yeah.
That's unsettling.
it is.
I mean, what does that tell us about just how pervasive this culture of corruption is?
It just highlights the sheer difficulty of combating corruption from within. Right. Because when the system itself is compromised, even those who are meant to police it
Yeah.
can be swayed. It's almost like trying to fight a virus that's infiltrated every cell in the body.
So what's the solution then? How do you even begin to address a problem like that when it's just so deeply entrenched?
It's a complex challenge.
Yeah.
There's no easy fix. But I think one key strategy is to establish truly independent oversight mechanisms that are not beholden to the very system they're supposed to be scrutinizing. So you need checks and balances from outside the organization to really ensure accountability.
So like a civilian review board or an independent prosecutor's office.
Exactly. You need an external force that can investigate allegations of corruption without fear of reprisal or interference from within the police department.
But Lee's story makes it clear that, that external oversight is only part of the solution, right?
Right.
We also have to address the cultural factors, the psychological tactics, the subtle ways in which corruption kind of takes root.
Absolutely. You have to foster a culture of ethics and accountability within the police force itself. So this involves, really robust training programs that emphasize ethical decision-making, clear guidelines on what constitutes corruption, and a system that really encourages officers to report misconduct without fear of retaliation.
It also seems like we need to be more aware of the subtle signs of corruption.
Yeah.
Right? Like you said earlier, it's not always about blatant bribery or extortion.
Right.
It can start with those seemingly harmless favors and a gradual erosion of boundaries.
That's why education is so important.
Yeah.
You have to train officers to recognize the slippery slope of corruption,
Yeah.
to understand how those seemingly innocuous actions can lead to these serious ethical breaches.
It's about changing the mindset,
Yeah.
the culture, the
Yeah.
very DNA of the organization.
Precisely. It's about creating an environment where corruption is not tolerated,
Right.
where ethical conduct is the norm, and where officers feel empowered to speak out against wrongdoing.
Lee's story serves as a stark reminder that, corruption isn't just a problem for law enforcement.
Right.
It's a human problem, a problem that can infect any organization
Yeah.
where power is unchecked and accountability is lacking.
And it's a problem that demands our attention, our vigilance, and our commitment to finding solutions. We can't afford to be complacent.
Well said. This deep dive has certainly been eye-opening, shedding light on a world that most of us will never see firsthand.
It's been a fascinating and really thought-provoking exploration of the complexities of corruption
Yeah.
and the challenges of combating it.
But there's one final piece of Lee's story that I'm still grappling with,
Okay.
and I'm sure our listeners are too. After all the risks he took, after exposing this intricate web of corruption, what happened to the officers involved? What were the consequences of their actions?
That's where Lee's story takes an unexpected turn. And it's a turn that raises some really profound questions about accountability and justice. You see, after all the risks Lee took, all that evidence he gathered, the consequences for the corrupt officers were minimal, to say the least.
Minimal? What do you mean minimal? After everything, like all that stuff with the bribery, the manipulation, the abuse of power, it sounds like they just got away with it.
Well, not entirely, but the punishments they received were certainly far less severe than you might imagine. For instance, the ringleader, Jimmy, the karaoke bar owner, he was basically bankrolling this whole operation, and he's still out there just living his life.
Oh,
And then the officers that Lee was working closest with, Sung and Yum, they're not in jail.
wow.
They're not even cops anymore. They basically just walked away.
It's hard to believe. It feels like a letdown after everything. You'd think that exposing something like this big,
Yeah.
would have serious consequences for those involved.
I understand how you feel, but the reality of it is prosecuting these cases, corruption cases, can be really complex and often very frustrating.
Yeah.
And remember, Lee even had to vouch for all the money he'd received as part of his undercover work.
Right.
That means that Internal Affairs was fully aware of the extent of the bribery.
So then why weren't there more serious consequences? I don't get it.
Well, it's difficult to know for sure without having all the details of the legal proceedings. There might have been issues with the evidence, concerns about Jeopardizing other investigations, or maybe even plea deals were made in exchange for testimony against higher-ranking individuals.
I guess. It still feels like a slap on the wrist, though.
Yeah.
Like the system just protected itself instead of holding the people who did it accountable.
That's a valid point, and I think it emphasizes something really crucial. The fight against corruption is not just about uncovering it, it's also about having systems in place that actually punish it. Because if you have a system that actually punishes corruption, it deters others from doing the same thing.
Right. So after all this, what can we really take away from Lee's experience? How do we ensure that justice is actually served and that people who abuse their power are held accountable?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Lee's story really highlights how much we need robust legal frameworks that make it easier to prosecute these cases, independent oversight bodies to hold law enforcement accountable, And we need a culture that values transparency and integrity, above all else.
And we also have to remember the role of people like Lee, whistleblowers who are willing to risk so much, their careers, their reputations, their safety, to expose the truth.
Absolutely. Whistleblowers are essential. They're like the canaries in the coal mine.
Yeah.
They warn us that there's danger. They show us the corruption that's happening that we might not see. Their courage is crucial for holding institutions accountable and for driving real change.
It's true. Lee's story is a cautionary tale, but it's also a call to action. It reminds us that corruption can exist in the places we trust most, and it challenges each of us to pay attention, to speak out against wrongdoing, and to demand better from those in positions of power.
It's a powerful reminder that the fight against corruption is a constant struggle. It's a marathon, not a sprint, and it requires the effort of individuals, institutions, and society as a whole.
Throughout this whole deep dive, we've mostly been focusing on the NYPD, but as we've said before, the patterns of corruption that Lee uncovered are not unique to them.
Right.
This can happen in any organization, in any industry, really anywhere where there's a concentration of power and a lack of accountability.
This is an important point for all of you listening out there. While this is Lee's story and it's specific to the NYPD, the lessons we can learn from it are applicable to so many situations. This is a reminder that we all have a role to play in safeguarding the integrity of the systems that govern our lives.
So what can we do as individuals to combat corruption wherever we might find it?
The first step is awareness. Learn about corruption, how to spot it, the subtle ways it can show up, and the mechanisms that allow it to flourish. Then be vigilant. Pay attention to what's happening around you, at work, in your community, in the institutions you're a part of. And don't be afraid to speak up. If you see something wrong, if you think something corrupt is happening, report it.
That's right. Speaking out can be scary, but it's crucial. Whistleblowers play such a vital role in shining a light on these things and holding powerful people accountable.
They do.
This deep dive has been really thought-provoking. It's been a reminder of how widespread corruption is and how hard it is to fight against it. But it's also been inspiring to see people like Scrate Lee who stand up for what's right, even when it puts them in danger.
It has been inspiring, and it's been a call for all of us to be more vigilant, more engaged, more committed to creating a world where integrity and accountability are the norm.
Well said. Thank you, expert speaker, for all of your insights. And to all of our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the dark side of police corruption. We hope you feel more informed, more engaged, and maybe even a little bit more empowered to make a difference.